Jesus is the ultimate example of one who lived out his worldview. His worldview was uniquely comprehensive. As a creator, and then entering into his own creation, he had the ability to see the world the way that we'll never see it. But by growing close to Jesus and by studying him, not just Gospels, but studying him as a person, we can come closer to living out our worldview as our worldview grows closer to his. Living out one's worldview answers the question, does he himself believe what he says? Now, I want you to think about Jesus and whether or not he really believed what he said. Okay? Well, what evidence would you bring to that? He was willing to die by those words. What about the apostles? Did they believe what they said? Yeah. So the fact that someone is willing to die for what they believe is not necessarily proof that what they believed is true, but it is proof that they believed it. Because I don't know too many people who would die for a lie, knowingly die for a lie, unless they had some other agenda to uphold. And it had to be a big one, right? So, and this stands as one of the great testimonies over the years, is that the Apostle Paul was willing to take those beatings. He was willing to be stoned. He was willing to go to prison, all to uphold a point of view, all to declare that the things that he said were true. What did he say that was true? Primarily, that Jesus came into the earth, that he lived his life, that he died according to Scripture, that he was buried, and he was raised again after 3 days, according to Scripture. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 1 through 3. That's Paul's worldview. Now, he believed that, and the other apostles believed that, because they were all willing to lay down their lives for the same story. The same story. Not 12 different stories, but the same one. And so this is the cost of a worldview lived out. The Christian worldview is ultimately self-sacrificial by its nature. Jesus sacrificed himself. We are all called to do the same. Now, if we were called to do that and Jesus never did, then I suppose that would be unfair, even if it was true. But he did so and lived that life out, went through the things that he went through, and died so that we could inherit his view on the world, among many other things. And so it's coincidental, perhaps, that this gospel meeting is centered around this basic idea. Then Jesus told his disciples, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life would lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. So this is Jesus passing on the seriousness of his worldview to his disciples. Here's Peter. Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery trial when it comes upon you to test you, as though something strange was happening to you. You ever feel singled out? But rejoice insofar as you share Christ's sufferings, that you may also rejoice and be glad when his glory is revealed. I know this is painful to listen to. I'm sorry. If you're insulted for the name of Christ, you're blessed because the Spirit of glory and of God rests upon you. It's a different view of suffering, isn't it? If you suffer because you're a Christian, you're blessed. That's exactly what Jesus said, isn't it? In the Sermon on the Mount, he said, blessed are you when men revile you and persecute you and say all manner of evil against you for my sake, for great is your reward in heaven. Or so they persecuted the prophets which were before you. And Paul writes, indeed, all who desire to live a godly life in Christ will be persecuted. It might take some time to know what that means. Eventually you'll know. The Spirit himself bears witness with our spirit that we're the children of God. And if children, then heirs, heirs of God and fellow heirs with Christ, provided we suffer with him, in order that we might also be glorified with him. So this is deeply embedded in the Christian worldview. Peter talked about it. Paul talked about it. Jesus talked about it right from the beginning. So possessing a Christian worldview is not an intellectual assent to a point of view. It's easy to say, yeah, I'm on board with that. I believe that. It's different when you're willing to put your life on the line for what you believe. And that ultimately, as I said, is what all Christians are called to. What questions or comments do you have about what somebody take the pressure off of me here.
Just think about Jesus, the ultimate, as you said, he was willing to die for what he said he did. But and really he called us to be living sacrifices. And just how challenging that is. You're right, the ultimate is to die, for what you believe. I tell you what a close second is actually living out that sacrifice on a daily basis. And to me, that's the equivalent and tantamount to living out your worldview.
Yeah. Those little choices that you make, the little indications that you give to the people around you, that you belong to someone, that we're not our own. Very good. Anybody else?
As you were talking, I was thinking like of it being a sacrificial worldview. I was thinking of John 3:16 and 1 John 3:16 in conjunction. John 3:16 talks about God sacrificing his only begotten Son. And 1 John 3:16 says, by this we know love because Jesus laid down his life for us. And then in the same sentence it says that we also ought to lay down our lives for the brethren. It talks about if we don't, help our brethren out in the things that they need, how does the love of God even abide in us?
Yeah. It's not my problem isn't an option for Christians, is it? And your worldview better be built on a rock. Because the rains are coming. Now, I've noticed that this audience mostly consists of people whose worldviews are already set. We pretty much know what we believe, don't we? We need to be deliberately developing this worldview in our young, even before they know what a worldview is. And it needs to be theirs, not ours. You moms are clever. You know how to do this with your kids. Think about ways that you can develop a worldview in a young child and make it theirs, not yours. This class may be kind of a stream of consciousness. I tried to think how to organize the material in a way that it presented in nice little packets, with headings and subheadings and all that. Turns out the way my mind thought through this, it didn't lend itself to this. It's much the way the First Peter was written. Just kind of like, you ever try to outline First Peter? That's a tough one. It's a kind of stream of consciousness, but it's also a logical progression. So please follow the logic my poor logic if you can. Okay, so relatively few have a worldview of which they can take ownership. Is that true? How many people do you think out there in the world, if you ask them what their worldview is, would have a ready answer for you? I think there are some. There are some, especially those from within Christendom. But probably a good many people out there really don't. If they have a worldview, they've never articulated it. So think about how demonstrative it is, how illustrative it is if they run into somebody who has a worldview and lives by it. It's different.
They want to kill you.
They might. If your worldview runs up against theirs, they might. Yeah, we can't let that be us. We need to have a worldview. We need to know what it is. Not everyone is either well informed enough or eloquent enough to articulate his own worldview down to the details. And I mean among us. Maybe that public speaking is not your thing. But we all ought to be able to tell other people in broad strokes, through our words and through our actions, what do we believe and why do we believe it? Peter said it this way: always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you, yet do it with gentleness and respect. I find two kinds of people, gentle and respectful, and those who know their worldview and can articulate it. Those two are not necessarily the same, and that's unfortunate. We need to be able to articulate our worldview in broad strokes, but we also need to be able to be respectful when we do it. Because what good is it if you make the best arguments and you speak with the most forceful words and you're disrespectful to the people you're talking to? Who's going to be attracted to that? Jesus did both. Now, what this does not mean is that every college freshman should be able to stand toe-to-toe with his biology professor on the fine points of evolutionary theory. Good luck with that. So, you go to biology class, you've got this strident atheist professor, and he's trying to ram this stuff down your throat. What do? Well, spend some time thinking that, but it's probably not a good idea to try to pick an argument with him from the back of the room unless you're really well skilled in what you believe, and then only if you can do it with respect. So, Peter, when will anyone ever even inquire about our hope? Anybody ever come to you and say, hey, why do you have hope? Probably not. But there are lots of ways to ask that question. And it can come up in 100 different contexts. When will someone come to you and say, why do you have hope? This is a question for you. It's not rhetorical. I'd like to hear an answer. Some answers.
They must have seen something in your life, the way you, maybe the way you respond to other people, the way you treat other people.
Okay? Could be something simply as general as they've observed your life over a period of time and they say, I don't know what that guy's got, but I want it. Could be that.
I've had people just notice happiness. I mean, like, and I think sometimes we separate out joy and happiness, and we're like, it's not about happiness. Well, it kind of is in a way,
Yeah.
because if we have the joy of the Lord, that's going to translate into a general disposition of happiness and positivity, and people notice that.
Okay, great. Positive attitude. When is a positive attitude most likely to be seen?
Something bad is happening.
All right, when something bad is going on. The fruit of the Spirit is love and joy and peace and patience and kindness and so on, even at times when things are not going well. And that's what makes a contrast with the rest of the world, and it's contrast that people will likely notice. Okay, what else? Anything else?
I think the thing that really makes a difference when people go to Christian funerals that aren't Christians, and they find out how the rest of the people are reacting to the person that's passed on. You know, the majority of funerals, people are bawling their eyes out because of, of the loss. But Christians are happy because that person has lived a good life and they're going to be with God.
Okay. Yeah. So let us not sorrow as those who have no hope, Paul says. If you live a hopeless life and you die a hopeless death, there's not a lot for people to be happy about when you've passed. It's true that the Christian worldview does lend itself to a certain positive outlook on death, because death is what we all live toward, right? And that's true in general, whether people accept it or not. We all living towards death. Question is, what kind of attitude do you have toward death in yourself and in the fellow Christians? First Peter was written in anticipation of severe persecution. And it's all about suffering well, suffering as a Christian. And can you imagine what the people around the Apostle Paul would have thought? Seeing him get up from having been beaten and saying, okay, let's go get at it.
They probably thought he was nuts.
What?
They probably thought he was nuts.
Yeah, they probably did. Festus did. Yes,
You know,
John.
I think there's an interesting thing here to think about, which is people will provoke you to try to get you to fail, to see your failure as a Christian.
Yeah.
Period. I mean, they thrive on saying, "Oh, gotcha," you know, you are not like Christ. You're not. I think maybe a lot of this was preparation for people provoking them when they're preaching the gospel and trying to get them to stumble and trip up and say, "How can you do this?" You know, if you don't let your tempers flare, if you don't get angry, or even if you're right, even in truth, then Christ can be seen, maybe even more so than the words that you're saying. And that's definitely a constant struggle in myself, to even if I'm right or standing in truth, to not let my emotions get the best of me. And I think it's really important because people, like you were saying, like you said earlier, people don't want to hear you if they're not being treated with respect.
Right. I'm listening to a series of podcasts put on by a guy by the name of Justin Brierley. Anybody know who that is? Very famous apologist. And spends all of his time interviewing people with all kinds of worldviews from across the spectrum, including staunch atheists. One of the things that I've learned from his podcast is how to ask good questions and treat people with respect, even when you disagree with them. He's really good at that. The podcast series I'm listening to is The Surprising Resurgence of Belief in God, or Rebirth of Belief in God. There's a book that goes with that series. Really well done by a lifelong apologist Christian. And because of his demeanor in talking to people, people will talk to him. He draws people out and he gets them talking. And, people get caught in their own traps sometimes when they talk. And it's not his purpose to try to get somebody caught in a trap. It's trying to get them to contrast worldviews as he's talking to them. And so sometimes he prods them a little bit. Sometimes he just lets them free run, just let them talk. And sometimes he's always asking deep, probing questions that will cause someone to think a little bit deeper about why they believe what they believe. Fascinating. In general, when faced with crisis, that is when your transcendent hope will show through most clearly. Okay? This passage also suggests that the Christian worldview is not overly burdened with heavy fixation on persecution and consequences. Go back to that verse where it talks about treating people with respect. You're all tied up in your own mind, feeling heavily burdened by your persecutions and the consequences of living out your worldview. Jamie, where's your joy? Where is your happiness? It gets erased, easily erased by the weight of what you're dealing with. Yes. Gloria.
Well, I do think that having a conversation about all of this, sitting here in Bowling Green, Kentucky, some of this seems a bit hypothetical to us, whereas if we were a group of believers gathered in many, many countries around the world today, Sudan, Afghanistan, Iran, Cuba, Venezuela, I think we would be having a very lively, different discussion about these things, because there are believers around the world going through severe persecutions and have been and will continue.
I've met some.
I encountered that in college. I was a geology major, and I think a lot of science type majors encounter that. How can you believe in a God that is so wrathful? Or they would say God is impersonal. He was the clockmaker, and he set it in motion. That's what we believe. And how can you believe in that kind of God that would hurt people? Speaking of punishment in the Old Testament, or things like that. And so I do think that we encounter those things, maybe not where we feel super threatened, but as a very, very new Christian, I didn't have a lot of answers to those questions, and I would have to say, I don't know. I'll have to get back to you on that one, and that's okay.
Yeah, that's a good answer. Sometimes it's the best answer. As it turns out, a lot of the scientists don't have as many answers as they purport to. You dig a little deeper, you'll find that their so-called knowledge is fairly superficial. And it's not because they're dumb, and it's not because they're uninformed. It's because do your very best. Spend your whole life studying about these sorts of things. And there are always such greater depths. And every generation we find out how much greater depth of understanding we lack in the scientific community.
I think it's comforting to know that people who have studied how people are convinced of things and how people change their minds, it's not down to those facts and those knowing all the perfect arguments. That is such a tiny piece of what actually convinces people.
Yeah.
And so I think sometimes we feel a lot of pressure to be very well versed, but that's not even what people are looking for. They're
You're
looking
right.
for meaning, and
Yeah.
we have that.
What we think of as that one-line zinger that's going to change everybody's mind doesn't exist. There is no one-line zinger that's going to change everybody's mind. People's minds are not changed like that. When we talk about apologetics, we'll talk about some of the views about how people form opinions and how they maintain them. And if you hope to have an impact on people, what you might do as a way of breaking down strongholds, as Paul puts it. Very good. How are we doing? Christian life properly lived will be characterized by joy, peace, kindness, respect for others. If you forget that as you're in the heat of an argument, sorry, but you've shot yourself in the foot. You'll never convince anybody. And the person who says lost my train of thought right in mid-sentence. Well, maybe I'll come back to that. I had it a couple minutes ago. It just reoccurred to me. Maybe it'll occur to me in a couple minutes. Brain fog. Gotta love it. Jesus was a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. When we read the New Testament, we read those conflicts that he had with the Pharisees, where he's jousting with them verbally. We tend to think that that's what Christianity really is all about. It's about jousting with people verbally. It's about engaging people in arguments and coming up with something that's more clever than what they had to say. But Jesus was also full of hope, optimism, and goodwill towards others. And this was the contrast in Jesus' own life and personality that people found fascinating. He wasn't austere like the Pharisees and the Sadducees. He was hopeful and joyful. Did the things he did out of the best interest of other people. That should be our motive also. We don't forget our motive, then maybe we'll be more successful in talking to people.
Backing up to the Christian life properly lived will be characterized by your joy, peace, kindness, respect for others is extremely important in front of your children and your grandchildren.
Yes.
Extremely important, because how you act is how they're going to act, because they're copycats.
Yeah. And they're going to know who you really are behind the mask, right? Okay, it's the guy who says, did come back to me. It's the guy who says, I'm a Christian, so be like me. Doesn't stand a chance. Because people are going to be constantly watching that guy, trying to find him in a mistake. And they're going to find it. They are going to find it. But if the message that we take to other people is, don't be like me, because I'm all this, I'm so great. Be like Jesus because he was great. I'm a follower of Jesus because I know I'm not great. And I know I need grace from God. And Jesus will teach me how to be better. Jesus is not making me, he is trying to lead us toward perfection. But when you come up out of the water as a new Christian, you still carry a lot of baggage, don't you? You still, not the baggage of sin and guilt, but the baggage of habits poorly formed. And when you deal with people day to day. You deal with them with your tiredness and with your temper and with your cold or whatever. You know, you're dealing with people. You're dealing with them as a person, and all of those complex emotions can come across in the way that we talk to other people if we don't have mastery of ourselves. So Jesus was about self-mastery, and he was the master after all. So when we point people to Jesus and away from us, they're more likely to believe what we say and agree to our worldview than if we try to point to ourselves. I actually had people say to me, I can't talk to anybody else about being a Christian because I know my imperfections. That's sad. We should be able to talk to people about Jesus because of our imperfections, right?
That's why Peter and Paul were there. And look at, imagine the Apostle Paul talking to people about what they ought to be and following Jesus. And here's a man who's put Christians to death.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, talk about baggage.
And Peter as well. I mean, we see all of Peter's mistakes and we laugh at them sometimes and yet equate what he did later in life.
Okay, so being a Christian means that you can make a mistake. And it can be a doozy. And because of the grace of Christ and forgiveness, you can still be a Christian, even when you haven't lived up to your worldview. So again, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks for a reason for hope that is in you, yet do it with gentleness and respect. 5 minutes. If I didn't know you personally, would I ever ask you why you're such a hopeful person when you're undergoing trials? If I were to ask you right now, why do you have hope? How would you respond? Some of you would have a ready answer. Some of you have rehearsed it. Some of you have told others. I'm going to make a suggestion that you take 20 minutes. You can't give a ready summary of your worldview verbally to someone who asks you. Take 20 minutes and write it out. What is your worldview? Where are you coming from? I don't understand you. Say you have hope. Why do you have hope? An exercise worth doing. Not that I didn't have one, but I've been forced to do this exercise, to write it out myself so that I could articulate it more clearly. This is worth a lot more time than 20 minutes. Doing it is very much worth having done it. If you haven't done this, or if you haven't heard yourself speak those words, you need to say them. Yeah, come up with the words, write them down. Rehearse them. Be ready, like Peter said. I'm done. I'm done early. Does anyone have anything that they'd like to add what's already been said? Yes, sir.
I think sometimes people can ask you about the hope within you without using those words.
Absolutely.
And I think I've been asked that a lot in different ways. It may be, why do you do this? Why do you not do that? Certain things. Or you here? And at the time, I thought, well, that's obvious, I'm here to teach these lessons, and, you know.
Yeah, right.
But I think the deeper, after thinking about that, you know, I think the deeper question was, what motivates you to be here and, you know, fly all the way across the ocean and be here in this hotel room talking to us about the Bible? What's the hope behind that?
Right, right.
And so that question can come across in a lot of different ways.
Yeah. And one of the mistakes that we can make is to shut that down rather than explore it with people, right? We could just give them a flippant answer off the cuff and not really answer the question. But yeah, I've been asked the same question in China many times. Why are you here? Why are you doing this? Fair question. What's the real answer?
Jesus.
Pardon?
Jesus.
Yeah, that's right.
And that's not a flip answer.
It's not.
That's what it all boils down to.
Yeah, but I'll challenge you to take it a little deeper because the Chinese people don't know who he is.
Because he cares.
Okay?
Because he knows.
Isn't he the guy who wrote the Bible?
Because he's able.
Okay. Yeah. Good answers. What I try to do when I talk to people is try to think about where that person is at. Where are they coming from? Where in this scheme of trying to find a worldview or having a worldview, where do they shake out? Very often you find the thing to say to them, to best say to them, based on where you think you find them on the spectrum. It could be someone with whom you have almost nothing in common in terms of the way that you think or why you think these things. Could be someone who you've never even met before. You have to ask questions to sort of feel people out and find out where they're coming from before you can give an answer that will be really beneficial to them. So it's not only finding an answer, it's sometimes finding the best answer for the person that you're talking to. And that can vary a lot based on your circumstances. It's different from the guy in China to the guy that I spoke to in the lab, who grew up in a Christian family but had been scientifically indoctrinated and had more or less cast it all aside. Very different answers. Thank you all. We made it. Not in fine style, but we made it.